Topic 50, The Great Society, 1964 to 1974. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need these notes to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to define the Great Society, name at least 5 goals of the Great Society, and assess the extent to which the Great Society programs achieve those goals. As we've seen in earlier podcasts, the robust post-war economy of the United States permitted many Americans to enter the middle class in the 1950s. Nevertheless, there were limits to this post-war affluence, as author Michael Harrington discussed in his 1962 book, The Other America. President John F. Kennedy had planned to remedy persistent poverty in urban areas, among racial minorities, and in rural communities like Appalachia. After Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson took charge of this project. As a young schoolteacher in rural Texas, Johnson had witnessed poverty among his Mexican-American students, and as president in May 1964, he committed to build a, quote, great society where no child will go unfed and no youngster will go unschooled, unquote. The Great Society that Johnson spearheaded consisted of a broad range of programs that encompassed civil rights, education, health, the arts, and most significantly, a war on poverty. We've already examined the grassroots civil rights movements among African Americans that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Both pieces of legislation belong to the Great Society and its commitment to social justice. The Immigration and Nationality Services Act brought this goal to those who hoped to enter the United States by abolishing the national quota system that had governed immigration policy since 1924. This 1965 change in the immigration law permitted Latin Americans and Asians to enter the United States much more easily, and within a generation began to influence the demographic makeup of the nation. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 was the most important educational component of the Great Society, providing more than $1 billion to jumpstart special education programs in schools with a high percentage of low-income students. This act broke with prior precedent that forbade federal aid to education, typically seen as the domain of the states. This act also established Head Start, which provided nutrition and early childhood education in low-income communities. In the realms of health and well-being, the Great Society established Medicare for the health insurance of older Americans, Medicaid for that of welfare recipients, and food stamps for the nutritional needs of poor Americans. The Great Society also committed the United States to the arts through the establishment of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Funding for these agencies was expanded under the Nixon administration. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting and National Public Radio, both nonprofit entities, were also founded and funded through the Great Society. The Great Society also committed to bolster public transportation, safeguard the environment, protect consumers through labeling and disclosure standards, rehabilitate urban areas through rent subsidies and home improvement loans and banning racial discrimination in housing, improve the socioeconomic conditions of rural areas, and increase the federal minimum wage. The most significant collection of Great Society programs fell under the rubric of Johnson's War on Poverty. Its focal point was the Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO, which oversaw various grassroots efforts to combat poverty. The OEO was guided by the philosophy that providing community-based education and job training to the poor was the best way to eliminate poverty. As such, it gave birth to programs like Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, a domestic version of the Peace Corps, Job Corps, intended to teach young people marketable skills, and Head Start. The impact of the Great Society has been mixed. While federal aid to the poor tripled between 1960 and 1968, critics argue that the $22 trillion in today's dollars spent on Great Society programs has saddled Americans in debt, promoted art with often questionable value, and witnessed education scores among American youth plummet. Although the percentage of African Americans living in poverty dropped from 55 to 27% during that same period, conservatives argue that the Great Society's welfare benefits destroyed the African American family structure by normalizing out-of-wedlock births in the Black community, which rose from 25% during the mid-1960s to 73% in 2014, according to the Washington Times on May 21st of the same year. These critiques led Congresses in the 1970s and 80s to cut funding for some Great Society programs and to dismantle some of its core agencies like the OEO. Despite these cuts, many Great Society programs, such as Medicaid, Medicare, Food Stamp, Head Start, and federal support for educational programs, remain to this day. And it's difficult to argue that the Great Society was a total failure when the percentage of Americans living in poverty dropped from 22.2% in 1963, when Johnson took office, to 12.6% in 1970, just 7 years later. While in 2015, 45 years later, the percentage of Americans living in poverty has risen to 13.5%. Please take a moment to review the learning objectives for this podcast. Write out each one in a sentence or paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen, and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can answer all of the learning objectives. Good luck!